Well, the Bible makes it really clear that Satan is the ruler of this world. As we said last night, from what John tells us, that the whole world lies under the sway of the evil one. The Apostle Peter is the one who uses the picture, he uses the analogy that Satan is like a lion and that Satan is roaming about the world like a vicious lion. He's a roaring lion and he's looking for people to devour. He's out to get us. And that's the image that Peter wants us to see. We are the potential victims of Satan. And yet, Satan is far more subtle than to come appear to us most of the times to look like a lion. He's smarter than that. He knows how to dress things up to be very attractive that are not attractive. He knows how to make something look safe when in reality it is very dangerous. And he wants to lure us, he wants to lure you into this world. Sometimes Satan will use a friend. He will use a family member to entice us. Just like he did in the Garden of Eden with Adam. He used Eve as part of the bait to entice him into sin. Satan is the master of disguise. Some of you know the story of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Seen the movie. He is a master of disguise. Well, Satan's far better at the master of disguise than the Scarlet Pimpernel. He's been in the business of luring people into this world for several thousand years. He has in his bag lots of tricks that he knows works because he's used them thousands and thousands of times and people have fallen for them and fallen for them and fallen for them. He doesn't need new tricks. He's got a bag full of old ones that he has proven to be very successful when he uses them. Or change the analogy. Satan is like a champion fisherman. The fisherman who is very skillful doesn't just use the same bait every time in every situation. He doesn't just use the same thing to catch every fish. He is skillful. And he uses lures to attract the fish to the hook. Now, I was thinking that maybe by now you would be sleepy, so I have brought a little help along with me. And in this box, someone in our church who's into fishing in a big way provided me with a lure. That is what's used to catch fish by this certain member in our church. So you get an idea of the type of fish that he's out to catch if that is the bait. Now, of course, it's not a real fish, it's a lure. Okay? And the effectiveness of such a lure like this is, of course, as it has the attached to the line and it's in the water, and if there's sun that's coming through the water, it glitters in the water. It twists and it turns. It appears like a fish. It appears like a very attractive fish. It's going to grab the attention of a bigger fish that's floating past when it sees this and it thinks, food for me, because I'm a bigger fish and I'm going to swallow this. It looks harmless enough from the distance. Glittering and turning. What's the big fishy seeing? He's seeing this, isn't he? That's what he's seeing. But that poor, unsuspecting little, or big fishy, doesn't realise that attached to this yummy bait are these razor-sharp hooks. This fishing lure serves, I think, as a helpful illustration as to how Satan dresses up worldliness to make it appear so appealing to us. We're like the big fish. Satan's the fisherman. He uses these different lures, the pretty bait, and he wants to attract us to this, but ultimately he's not interested in this issue. He's interested in getting us hooked on one of these. He dresses up worldliness to appear very, very attractive, but he wants us to be hooked on the world. You see, Satan knows that we're not perfect. He knows that dwelling within us is the corruption of sin, that the depraved nature is within us, and that we are tempted into sin when we are actually drawn away by our own desires and enticed. We can't blame Satan for everything. James says it comes from within us. We're drawn away, we're enticed by our own evil desires. It's just all that Satan does is put a lure in front of us. He puts the bait in front of us. He puts the right bait in front of you because he knows what type of fish you are. He knows what your appetite is or what your desires would be that will appeal to you. He's a clever fisherman. That poor unsuspecting fishy, with his fishy nature, is drawn away, is enticed to the bait, that right bait, suited for that fish. But of course, it gets hooked. If any fishy is going to be smart enough to not get hooked, to not get caught, it obviously needs to know that that's not real. It's not what it appears to be, at least. He needs to understand that this very thing is a trap, that is designed to hook us and to catch us. And that fish, if it's going to be smart enough, needs to know that he has to avoid that lure. So you and I, like the fish, Satan trying to entice us, we need to therefore recognise what are the subtle enticements that Satan may use to try and hook us. And in many ways, that's what John now does in this passage that we began to look at last night in 1 John chapter 2. In verse 15, as we saw last night, he commands us not to love the world, to beware of one's own heart's affection when it comes to this evil age. But he also opens up, if you like, what worldliness is or what worldliness does, the subtle enticement. And he mentions three things in verse 16 of 1 John 2. If you have a look at that verse with me, you will see the three things. He says, for all that is in the world, and then it's like in brackets, these are the things that are in the world. The lusts of the flesh, the lusts of the eyes, and the pride of life. Closes the brackets. All those things, all that is in the world is not of the Father, but is of the world. Three areas in the brackets. Three areas that Satan seeks to capture our hearts. He seeks to hook us on worldliness, which in the end is designed to destroy us. The reason in the end that this is thrown over the edge of a boat is because the guy up in the boat wants to destroy that fish. He wants him on his plate. He doesn't want that fish alive anymore. He wants him devoured. Remember, that's what Satan wants to do. He's like a lion seeking whom he may devour. There are two things I want us to think about as we look at verse 16 now. And I'm hoping, if time will allow, that then will give us an opportunity where we will have a time of discussion. We're going to break up into two groups. And I'm conscious that some of you are tired. You need to know that Saturday in the Kane's house is lolly day. So I have some lollies to give you some incentive to stay awake and to stay with me and to be involved with some discussion later. Two things. The subtle enticement, and then secondly, the sieve of discernment. First thing, the subtle enticement. Let's look now closely at each of these three matters that's in verse 16. All that is in the world, he says, the lust of the flesh. So as John uses this term lust, he's speaking about the desiring, the craving for the things of this world. Perhaps it starts out something we may have as a legitimate desire, but it grows. The cravings deepen and they almost become a demand. So in other words, there's an interest in clothes and fashion. But then it grows and it becomes a preoccupation. Or there's a love for music and it develops into an obsession for music. You see, the desire to enjoy even a good movie may become a need in your own thinking to see the latest blockbuster. You've just got to see it. So here John is particularly focusing in this first one on the indulging in fleshly pleasures, the sensual pleasures of life, done with, remember, no reference to God. These are the lusts felt by the flesh, the sinful, sensual appetites. Now naturally this can show itself in differing ways. Some of those ways would be sexual pleasures, fantasies, leading to flirting, to all sorts of sexual immorality. It could be uncontrolled appetites in the flesh that can lead to gluttony. You know, you like food, but then you just keep going back for it. You just keep it's gluttonous. Or drunkenness, revelry and parties, the whole issue that relates to that whole pursuit, even when it comes to the drugs. The point is, it's all about the flesh. Having the mind, having the emotions, having the body gratified by such lusts. Now we need to understand that those things are not harmless pleasures. They are not innocent times of fun. There is danger there. Think of the lure. There is danger there. That unsuspecting fish, it may seem attractive, it may seem harmless, but it has a hidden hook. How many get hooked on music? How many get hooked on fashion? How many get hooked on food, get hooked on sexual pleasures, get hooked on drink, get hooked on drugs? Satan is out to hook us. Now the Apostle Peter makes it very plain that the fleshly lusts war against our souls. Turn with me, go left in your Bibles to 1 Peter. Head back towards the middle, that is. Just a few pages probably. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. And listen to what Peter says. 1 Peter 2 verse 11. You see there, it says, "Beloved," he's writing to Christians, "I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims." I'm pleading with you. We're passing through this world, he says. This is not our home. But as we pass through this world, I beg you, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. It's the last part of the verse I want you to focus in on. The lusts of the flesh are enemies to the peace and welfare of our never-dying soul. The lusts of the flesh pollute the mind. They defile the imagination. They blunt the moral sense, and they affect our ability to make good judgments. They desensitize us. They make us numb toward holy things. The Bible says simply they harden our hearts. That's what they do. And yet it happens slowly, it happens subtly, it happens gradually. And the lusts of the flesh have a withering influence on the soul. That's why he says at the end of verse 11 there, they war against the soul. This is why Paul warns the Christians in the church in Rome. In Romans 13:14 he says, "Make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust." Don't play with it, he says. Make no provision for it. Do not put yourself in those situations which feed the lusts of the flesh. Make no, absolutely none. Make no provision. The smart fishy will not play with the lure, will it? If that fish has got any brains at all, he will make a wide berth around such a thing as this that may seem attractive. What sort of fish would it be who simply played around right around the edge of the hook? You'd say, what a foolish fish that is playing with that. If he really knows there's real danger there, he will stay away. So the first thing in 1 John 2:16 is the lust of the flesh. The second thing that he mentions in 1 John 2:16 is the lust of the eyes. Now we sometimes perhaps forget that our eyes, not just our stomachs, but our eyes can have an appetite. There is a common expression that perhaps we all use. Don't we say, "Feast your eyes on this"? And we may not be necessarily talking about food. But our eyes have an appetite. Feast your eyes upon that. You see, our eyes can see things and it provokes this craving within, this desire, this appetite that grows within our hearts. And Satan specialises in enticing us through what we see. He can do it other ways, but he specialises. He's really good at this part. The lure. Think again of the illustration. The lure, it is so attractive for the fish. Why? Because he comes up and Smells it? Because he comes up and nudges his nose on it and he touches it? No. The thing that is attractive for the fish is his eyes are captivated by this pretty lure that's glittering in the water in the sun. The lust of the eyes. You remember the story of King David. He was a mature man and he fell into the sin of adultery with Bathsheba. How did that occur? It was through the lust of the eyes. David was attracted to Bathsheba through what he saw. Now, I would say to you that Bathsheba should have been more careful in what she was doing. And as ladies, as young ladies, as Christian ladies, you need to be very careful in your dress. You need to be very careful in your presentation, because you can appeal to the lusts of the eyes of the members of the opposite sex. David is responsible, but I would suggest to you that Bathsheba had something to do by way of this as well. The 21st century media is such an effective lure that Satan uses. Many are hooked on worldliness via the lusts of the eyes through modern technology. But it's not just modern media. You know, in John's day, in the Apostles' day, in the first century, Christians had a battle with similar things, just like you and I do, when it comes to the lust of the eyes. This was written originally in the first century. It wasn't originally written for 21st century Christians. So obviously they had a battle in their day. You know, in the Greek and Roman culture, they had a successful entertainment industry. Long before Hollywood ever existed, the Roman and Greek culture had theatre. They would put theatres on, people would come and watch comedies, they would come and watch plays, they would even come and watch mimes in those days. It was common for them to have productions that contained obscenities. It was not all G-rated. It was common for them to have productions in theatre that had cruelties that were related to them, crudeness, violence, so violent that they would even kill criminals on stage in front of the audience. There were sexual acts performed on stage by prostitutes. The Colosseum contained 50,000 seats. When that was filled with people, they were there watching animals being killed. They were there watching the gladiators fight right to the end of their bloody deaths. A worldly entertainment industry was alive and well in that culture. The people would flock to hear obscenities. They would flock to see violence. They would flock to see people killing one another. They would flock to see sexual immorality performed before their very eyes. And guess what? Nothing has changed, has it? Nothing has changed. For centuries, Satan has been an effective fisherman, luring millions to be hooked on sin via the lust of the eyes. Such lures can glitter in front of us and they can be attractive to us. And we can be deceived to think that we can gain satisfaction and pleasure. But we need to be a smart little fishy. We need to see these things for what they are. We need to recognise that there's not just an attractive part to the eyes, but there are hooks in these very things. David says in Psalm 119 and verse 37, "Turn away my eyes from looking at worthless things." So as we think then about this, how are you going with that in terms of your own life? What are you captivated by? It's not going to be the same thing for every one of us. What images have the power to arouse your interest? It's probably what you're thinking about right now. We might ask ourselves, what value does that thing have? Really? If you're more excited about a new movie than about serving in the local church, if you're more drawn to people because of their physical attractiveness or their personality than their character, if you're impressed by Hollywood stars or professional athletes, regardless of their lack of integrity or morality, then you are being lured. You could already be hooked by the lust of the eyes. Turn away my eyes from looking at worthless things. Psalm 119, verse 37. The third matter that he speaks about in 1 John 2 and verse 16, he says, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, he then says, the pride of life. We're looking at the subtle enticement. Here's the third one, the pride of life. And surely this is something we are all familiar with. We find ourselves easily tempted to be proud of our work, to be proud of our talents, to be proud of our abilities, to be proud of our physical appearance, to be proud of our possessions, to be proud of our accomplishments. Perhaps we're too polite to boast about it, but secretly we revel in what we have, we revel in what we have done. We have a fairly high opinion of ourselves normally, and we want others to notice. And maybe we're even offended if they don't notice. John says here, beware of this enticement, the pride of life. And the term that John uses here is actually a strong term meaning boasting and even bragging beyond the real situation. This is surely one of the key marks of the world. Our world loves to big note itself. Self-promotion in our culture is just expected. If you can't promote yourself in the job interview, then you're going to be overlooked. So much of our society is just trying frantically to impress one another. So many buy things just to keep up appearance. Everyone's looking for approval, for honour, for the applause of others. Worldliness approves the promotion of self through the display of dress, through the latest fashion. Like, look at me. Look at me in my nice new car. Look at me in my nice new dress. Look at me in how I'm presenting myself. Look at me. Notice my new hairstyle. Look at me. I mean, aren't I such a good person for looking the way that I do? Aren't I such a good person because I possess such wonderful skills and abilities? I have this great knowledge. I've achieved all these things. Look at me. Applaud me. I need your approval. Satan loves to inflame our egos because he knows it will turn us away from God. And having a sense of dependence upon him and recognizing that all that I have in the end comes from God, and therefore it's not mine to boast in any way, but it's a gift from him. Satan doesn't want that. Satan wants us to turn our attention away from God. He wants to get God out of our minds. He wants us to be consumed with the things of this world. He's appealing to our pride. And in order to get this, he wants us to be pursuing this life so that we can have a life that's pursued, that's all about us and not about God. There are three main areas then that Satan can subtly entice us with to ensnare us in worldliness. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These three things, he says. Notice what he says in the end of verse 16. God is not in them. For all that is in the world, he then lists those three things. All those three things, all that is in the world, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And these things of the world are just so temporary, he says, they are not worth pursuing with all of that vigour and energy. And he says then in verse 17 this, the world is passing away. It's going to go. And the lusts of this world is passing away. But, and here's the contrast, don't be that person. Why would you waste your time with something that's passing away? Be this person. Pursue God. He says then, but he who does the will of God abides forever. So we've considered then something by way of the subtle enticement. Now let's think about the practical issue. How can we know what are the things we should avoid in the world? Now we're coming more closer to the issues that connect right down to our decision making when it comes to this issue. What are the things that are dangerous? What are those things that, like the fishing lure, that could be attractive to us but will actually hook us and that would be devastating for us? For instance, how do I know which movie I can see? How do I know which ones are dangerous that I should avoid? Which songs? Which music should I leave out? What fashions, what clothes should I bypass? How can we work our way through all of this? Well, I'm sure we all know the benefit of a filter or a sieve. You know, you put flour through a sieve in the kitchen, or if you're building something and you need to sieve the sand, or put it in some mixture for your concrete or something, that you have a sieve and you put that product, say we just say it's flour, into the sieve, and the purpose of that sieve is to separate the good from the bad. It's to remove the impurities. You pass that flour through the sieve to eliminate the impurities. So what comes out through it, therefore, is pure. What's left behind you can throw away. That's the impurity. You don't want all those dregs. You don't want all that bit. That's got to be thrown away. Well, God has given some key biblical principles that can act like that sieve, a sieve of discernment for thinking Christians. And when we apply these biblical principles, I think we can join ranks with the smart fishy. And we can see things as they really are. And we don't need to come up and smell. We don't need to come up and touch with our nose. We can give it the wide bypass right around and stay well clear of these dangers of the lures into worldliness. So let me put before you 3 biblical principles that I hope will be helpful for us to understand, taking those principles, apply in our own lives in these situations, that we can have a way to practically work through these things. So as we're thinking now, secondly, of the sieve of discernment, the first one is living before God. Living before God. If your eyes were drinking in a movie that had violence in it, that had sex scenes in it, or if your ears were hearing obscenities, or maybe you're visiting a suspect website and you're in the midst of doing those very things, whichever one it is, and Jesus comes into the room, literally, and he saw what you were watching or what you were listening to. He knew what you were listening. He could see that. He was right there. How would you feel as a Christian? Wouldn't you want to quickly change what you're viewing? Wouldn't you want to quickly grab the remote and quickly change it? Well, the point is, God is always in the room. He sees everything we do. Hebrews chapter 4 says, nothing is hidden from his eyes. We live our lives before the face of God. There is a phrase in Latin that actually says that. It's called coram Deo. Coram Deo, before the face of God. All aspects of our existence, whether it's private thoughts, whether it's public words, whether it's our actions, everything. Even the music that flows in our earphones, in our earplugs, from our iPods or MP3 players, it's all lived out before God's face. You see, when we keep constantly before our minds as a governing principle as to what we should do, as to what we should watch, as to what we should listen to, as to where we should go, the fact that we're living every moment before God, that will have a holy and helpful effect on our entertainment choices, for instance. You see that? It's a simple principle. It's a biblical principle. The first sieve of discernment will eradicate many things. There'll be many things left in that sieve that you can throw out. And there's lots of things. There are many, many things that will come through, that are the pure things, that are the right things, that are the lovely things, that are the things that we can delight in, and we can revel in. So the first one is living before God. Secondly, thinking about others. It seems to me that most often when people are thinking about these issues, when people are thinking about, well, what music can I listen to? What movie can I see? When they're thinking about those issues, they're normally just thinking about themselves and their own little world. But God also wants us to think about others. And the two big categories of people that we should be thinking about, we need to think firstly about non-Christians. And the reason we need to think about non-Christians is because if you are a Christian, they are watching you. And you may be the closest thing that they will ever see to have any idea of what Jesus Christ is like. So what impression of Jesus will they get if they see you engaged in that worldly activity? What would they be converted to if they became like you? Would it be any different to how they currently live? You see, our lives lived out before non-Christians might be the only Bible they ever read. The lives that they watch in us. What do our lives say? That may be the only Bible information they ever get to know. So we need to be thinking about others. We need to be thinking about non-Christians. But obviously we also need to be thinking about our fellow Christians. You see, as real as non-Christians are watching us, as real as that is the truth that other Christians are watching us, and most often younger Christians. And perhaps they're in your family. Maybe they are your friend. And your movie or your music choice could cause them to stumble. You see, applying this biblical principle, this sieve of discernment, will help us to avoid certain things for the sake of others. Now turn with me please to Romans, the book of Romans in chapter 14. And look at verse 15. Paul's dealing with something of a similar thing in terms of our conduct, to be mindful of other Christians in what we may see are liberties that we have to choose. In Romans 14 verse 15 he says, "Yet if your brother is grieved because of your food, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food the one for whom Christ died." Now let's just change that verse. Let me take the liberty. Let's not say food, but let's look at the verse again. And let's substitute the word food for music or movies. Now let's read it. If your brother is grieved because of your music, you are no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your movie the one for whom Christ died. He goes on to say there in the next verse, "Therefore let us pursue the things which make for peace, and by which one may be built up in their faith. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of your entertainment, your recreation." Do you see how this will affect us in what we will choose if we're taking this seriously and if we have a heart of love for other Christians, particularly younger Christians who we know personally? We need to think about how our choices in conduct affects others, and this too will weed out unnecessary things. They're not necessary. We're talking about optional things in life. The sieve of discernment. Here's the first sieve, living before God. We've got some stuff through there. Now we've got the second sieve, thinking about others. And we've got a third, and this is the last thing I want us to think about. Here's the third biblical principle, passing the Philippian test. You say, what? Passing the Philippian test. You know, probably the most common objections raised about choices of entertainment, places to visit, music to listen to, and so on. The most common objection is, the most common response is, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with these songs anyway? You ever thought that? If Mum and Dad had said you shouldn't listen to that? But what's wrong with this movie? You know, that's the wrong question. That's a completely wrong question. The question that we should be asking is, what's right with it? What's right with that song? What's right with that movie? Does this song, does this movie, does this web page pass the Philippian test? And if it doesn't, then we should leave it out. So the big question is, what's the Philippian test? Well, I'll take you to it. Philippians chapter 4, please. This is the last verse we'll look at. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Here is the Philippian test. Here is the third sieve that I'm wanting to raise for us to think about. Paul, he's writing to Christians, says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate, fill your mind, he says, with those very things. I want to suggest to you as we close that if every Christian applied this sieve, Philippians 4 verse 8, then the vast majority of Christians living in our seductive culture, even young people, would not have the same issues with worldliness. I trust you can see passing the Philippian test will help you to identify what should go and what can legitimately stay. And there are many, many, many things that can legitimately stay. Put the flour through one sieve in the kitchen, and that's good. But put it through 3, and it's even purer. So let me urge you, trying to discern this practical issue, what is right and wrong for me. Apply these 3 sieves, living before God, thinking about others, and passing the Philippian test, and it will greatly aid you in avoiding worldliness in conduct, which always recognise and remember that it ever remains an issue of the heart. We come back to that as we close. In the end, it is the issue of the heart.